In the spring of 1870, when Kentucky's skies had just begun to shrug off the weight of a long and bitter winter, a peculiar family stepped off a dusty train platform in the quiet town of Elkhorn Lick. They arrived with little fanfare, no cheering, crowd or grand announcement, but something about them made the townsfolk pause mid-stride and stare just a second too long. It wasn't their fine clothes or their northern accents. It wasn't even the fact that they spoke softly among themselves in a rhythm that felt rehearsed. It was the boys, 4 of them identical in every visible way, the townspeople would later claim. It was like watching one man multiplied. Same height, same wheat-colored hair, same piercing ice-blue eyes. Their mannerisms, too, were unnervingly alike, right down to the way they adjusted their collars or cleared their throats. Their names were Elias, Emory, Ezra, and Elijah Blackwood. 28 years old, or so they said. Sons of a wealthy businessman from Pennsylvania, or so the family claimed. But in Elkhorn Lick, a town still licking its wounds from the war and suspicious of outsiders by default, whispers started the moment the train left the station behind them. The patriarch, Horace Blackwood, introduced himself with a deep voice and immaculate manners. He handed out letters from banking houses in Pittsburgh and New York, all praising his business sense and financial reputation. His wife, Constance, a reserved woman dressed in mourning black, spoke barely a word in public. Yet she watched everything. Behind her veil, her eyes scanned crowds like a lighthouse searching for shipwrecks in fog. They had come, Horace said, to invest in Kentucky's post-war recovery, to establish a trade route, perhaps open a new warehouse near the river. He spoke the way men do when they expect obedience, and people listened at first. That first that it wasn't unusual for Eastern families to move westward during those years, chasing opportunity on the edge of Reconstruction. But there was something off about this particular group. It wasn't just that the boys looked the same, it was how they moved. Always in sync, always watching. They never interrupted each other, rarely raised their voices, and if one reached for a glass of water, the others seemed to mirror the gesture, as though pulled by invisible string. They moved into the old Kincaid estate on Briar Hollow Road, a 3-story home that had stood vacant since 1865. It had once belonged to a Confederate colonel who vanished during the last days of the war. Some said it was haunted. Others said that wasn't the problem. It was cursed. But the Blackwoods didn't seem bothered by the local superstitions. Within a week, the shutters were open, the porch swept clean, and workers hauled crates of ledgers, imported furniture, and heavy trunks up the steps. The town's curiosity burned hotter by the day. Shopkeepers whispered about how the brothers seemed to appear in multiple places at once. Elias might be seen negotiating grain prices down at the mill, while at the same hour, Emory was supposedly visiting the postmaster. Yet no one could prove they weren't simply rotating duties. After all, who could tell them apart? The mystery deepened when Mrs. Lillian Helcom, owner of the general store, swore under oath she'd spoken with Elijah at 10 a.m. about purchasing a barrel of kerosene. Just 10 minutes later, she watched the same man, same hat, same voice, same facial scar step out of the apothecary 2 streets over, carrying a small wrapped parcel. She chalked it up to confusion. Maybe she'd mistaken him for Ezra, but even then, she didn't quite believe herself. By early summer, the brothers had embedded themselves in every corner of town life. Elias handled banking affairs with the local loan office. Emory mingled with the town's small shipping guild. Ezra joined the town's social gatherings, charming widows and bachelors alike. Elijah, the quietest of the 4, kept records and handled correspondence, often spotted at the courthouse or town archives, always scribbling notes in an embossed journal. No one could deny they were intelligent, perhaps too intelligent. They asked the right questions, but also the wrong ones, private ones. Questions about who was behind on mortgage payments, which merchants had debts, which families kept safes in their homes, or valuables buried under floorboards. When confronted, the brothers always smiled. "We take interest in the community," they'd say. "You must understand business is built on trust and understanding." But behind those smiles, people felt something else. A discomfort they couldn't quite name. The feeling that the brothers already knew the answers to the questions they were asking. Sheriff Amos Tiller, a man not easily rattled, began to keep notes of his own. He wasn't a superstitious man, nor prone to rumor, but after a Sunday service, 3 different townsfolk approached him with troubling reports. All 3 swore they had seen the same Blackwood brother in 3 different places at once, at the church entrance, on the far side of the cemetery, and walking with a widow toward the bakery, all within a 5-minute window. Tiller tried to dismiss it. Maybe they'd seen different brothers. Maybe they'd been confused. But when he confronted Horace Blackwood about the sightings, the man simply chuckled. "With 4 sons that look alike," he said, "you'll be seeing double. All the time. Or triple or more." Still, something about the chuckle felt hollow. The first official report landed on the sheriff's desk on July 3, 1870. It came from Silas Gentry, a mule driver who delivered hay and grain between farms and the new river docks. According to his statement, he had watched Ezra Blackwood lead a conversation with a banker at 9 a.m., then passed Emory an hour later, standing outside the Presbyterian church. Both brothers were dressed in identical suits and wore identical blue neckties. That much could be explained. But at precisely the same time, 9 a.m., Silas had also seen one of the brothers crossing Dorsey Bridge, a full 3 miles outside. Of town. It wasn't the sighting that troubled him. It was the way the man looked at him, as if daring him to say something, as if he knew. The sheriff tucked the report into his file cabinet and locked it. He didn't know what was happening. Not yet, but he sensed it. Whatever was going on with the Blackwood brothers, it was only just beginning. And Elkhorn Lick, a town that had seen its share of blood, war, and fire, might soon learn there were darker things in this world than men with guns or ghosts with unfinished business. There are men who can make you question your senses. Men whose very presence bends reality. And the Blackwoods? They were not like other men. They were something else entirely. By the time August rolled into the valley and Elkhorn Lick baked under the sticky weight of a Kentucky summer, the Blackwood brothers had become fixtures of the town. Their presence was so constant, and yet so scattered, that most folks had simply given up trying to figure out which one they were speaking to. More often than not, they just refer to them collectively as Mr. Blackwood, as if one man could possibly be in so many places at once. What people didn't say aloud, but certainly thought, was that the brothers seemed to be playing a game, a trick, and the rest of the town? They were the audience, clapping politely at something they couldn't quite follow. It wasn't until the harvest market committee meeting on August 12th that things started to turn from curious to unsettling. The meeting was held at Town Hall, a monthly gathering of merchants and civic-minded locals, where folks argued over booth arrangements, festival themes, and whose turn it was to hang bunting along Main Street. On that particular day, a crowd of 25 or so packed the room, waving fans and dabbing their necks with kerchiefs. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, tobacco, and peach cordial. At the rear of the room, seated with a worn leather notebook and a stub of pencil, was Elias Blackwood. Or was it Emory? He sat still, barely blinking, and watched as debates over pie contests and livestock displays roared on. Every few minutes, he would jot down a word or two. When questioned about the details of booth placement, he rattled off numbers, vendor names, and exact coordinates with startling precision. "Didn't know the fella was even listening," muttered Hank Bodwin afterward. But he quoted me word for word. Even remember, I said, I'd bring 2 milk calves, and not one. So far, so normal, Dot, until that same evening, when Miss Clara Devonshire, schoolteacher known for her sharp memory, and even sharper tongue, stormed into Sheriff Tiller's office, pale as bone. I was at the meeting, she said, pacing the floor, but I also saw Mr. Blackwood, just before sundown. He was at my boarding house, helping Miss Langley carry trunks up the stairs. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. And you're sure it was him? I spoke to him, asked him what a man like him was doing lugging someone else's bags. He laughed and said, just lending a hand to a friend. Same voice, same smile, same little scar near the temple. Tiller leaned back in his chair and sighed. That made 3 separate reports in 2 weeks, all pointing to one impossible truth. Either the Blackwoods were more coordinated than a military drill team, or something stranger was at play. He decided it was time to watch them himself. The following morning, just after sunrise, the sheriff posted Deputy Clay Reeves on the south end of town, near the churchyard, with instructions to observe Elijah Blackwood, who was expected to meet the stonecutter about a donation for the cemetery fund. Tiller himself took up position near the riverside warehouses, where Ezra was supposedly meeting with dockworkers. Not both sightings happened at nearly the same time, and both men reported seeing the same Blackwood brother, wearing the same cream-colored vest and brown slouch hat, identical down to the sweat ring on the collar. That ain't possible, Clay said, squinting. Unless he can teleport, or he's got a twin. He's got 3, Tiller reminded him. But if he's got 3, why does everyone keep thinking they're speaking to the same one? Later that week, the sheriff decided to push a little. Harder, Dot, he visited the Blackwood residence unannounced, his boots crunching gravel as he stepped through the tall iron gate of the Kincaid estate. The porch creaked under his weight, but he didn't need to knock. The door opened before he reached it. It was Elijah. Or Ezra, or Emory. Sheriff, the man said warmly. We were just discussing you. Were you now? Tiller replied. Stepping inside, the house was tidy, silent, and strange in a way he couldn't define. Heavy drapes muffled the light. The scent of ink and old paper clung to every room. On the far wall hung a large chalkboard, filled with numbers, dates, and initials he didn't understand. A map of the county sat on the desk, marked in red circles and black slashes. He was ushered into the parlor, where all 4 brothers eventually joined him, one by one, each arriving from a different room. Not from outside. From within, they sat, opposite him in matching chairs, folded hands on knees, their gazes never straying far from his eyes. I've had some questions, the sheriff began. Some things don't add up. Please, said one of the brothers, Elias, perhaps we'd be glad to clear up any confusion. Tiller frowned. I've got you placed at 3 different locations in town, all at the same time. I'm talking verified witnesses. Churchyard, Riverside, and Miss Devonshire's boarding house. That's not an illusion or confusion. That's a fact. The brothers glanced at each other, barely moving, and then one of them spoke. With all respect, Sheriff, I think folks are just overwhelmed by our resemblance. We coordinate our schedules precisely to avoid overlap, but sometimes people blend memories. That so? It's quite common in cases of identical siblings, another chimed in. The mind fills in details, sees what it expects. The sheriff leaned forward. Then tell me this. Why do you all dress the same, walk the same, talk the same? Hell, I've seen parades with less synchronization. The brothers smiled, polite and empty. Discipline, said one. Habit, said another. Efficiency, added a third. Tiller didn't press further. Not yet. He left the house that day with more questions than answers. But one thing gnawed at him as he walked back toward town, the way the brothers looked. At each other, not like siblings, not like co-workers, but like mirrors, as if each man could finish the other's thoughts, because the thoughts were never truly separate to begin with. Later that evening, the Blackwoods were seen again. This time at the home of a local landowner negotiating a tobacco lease. 2 eyewitnesses swore they saw the same brother leave the estate at the same time another entered the bakery down the road. And yet again, both men wore identical suits. Both carried the same briefcase. And both used the same phrase when bidding. Goodbye. Success begins with precision. By the time September drew close, Sheriff Tiller wasn't just suspicious. He was scared. The first frost of September kissed the rooftops of Elkhorn Lick like a warning. The days had grown shorter, the shadows longer, and with each passing morning, the town felt more like a stage where something unseen stirred behind the curtains. Sheriff Tiller, a man who'd faced down drunks, thieves, and Civil War deserters, now found himself chasing ghosts. Not the kind that rattled chains in the night, but flesh and blood men who moved through town like whispers heard in 2 places at once, always just out of reach. He'd received another report, this one from Reverend Arnold Grant, who had always scoffed at rumors. The Reverend had seen Ezra Blackwood enter the chapel at dawn, kneel at the altar, and pray for nearly 30 minutes. Later that same morning, the Reverend claimed to have seen the very same man arguing politics on the front steps of the newspaper office, gesturing emphatically with his hands. It was him, Reverend Grant insisted. Same voice, same scar near the eyebrow. I may be a man of faith, Sheriff, but I know what I saw. Tiller didn't doubt the Reverend's conviction. What troubled him was that 2 other townsfolk had made similar claims that week describing. Ezra, or someone who looked exactly like him, being in different places at the same hour, always wearing the same attire, always carrying the same worn satchel with brass corners. The sheriff sat in his office that evening, the lamp flickering on the edge of its oil, and spread out the latest witness statements on his desk. He'd begun marking sightings on a map of the town. Red pins for confirmed appearances, blue for questionable. The problem was, nearly every pin had some sort of corroboration. He ran his fingers along his mustache and leaned back. No one man could be in all those places at once, unless, of course, the townsfolk weren't seeing one man, unless they were seeing 4. But even then, how did each Blackwood seem to know everything the others did? Conversations, deals, debts owed, secrets whispered in private. It was like they shared one mind, or one memory stretched across 4 faces. That's what unsettled him most. Later that week, the town's only telegraph operator, Ben Creighton, visited the sheriff with a strange report. Got a message from Paducah, Ben said, scratching the back of his neck. Nothing too odd. Just some trading figures and warehouse bookings. But the man who signed it name was Elias Blackwood. Same handwriting, same penwork, same signature as the one from here. You think someone forged it? The sheriff asked. No, sir. I don't. That's the thing. It looked too real. And we've had Elias at the courthouse here, filing documents. Just yesterday. How could he be setting up business in Paducah the same week? Tiller rubbed his temple. The map on his desk was starting to look less like a pattern and more like a puzzle. And the Blackwoods? They were the missing piece and the edge frame all at once. He decided to test a theory. Early one Monday morning, he sent his deputy, Clay Reeves, down to Dandridge's farm on the South Road, where Emory was supposedly brokering a deal for cattle. At the same time, Tiller stationed himself outside the Whitlow Bank, where word had it that Ezra would be in attendance for a loan meeting. Both men saw the respective Blackwood. Both were convinced it was Emory's same coat, same mannerisms, same signature when they signed documents. And the timestamps? Identical. 10 a.m. sharp. They met back at the sheriff's office with matching tailies. That was the day the sheriff stopped, trying to prove something impossible was happening. He already knew. The real question became how. On Tuesday, the Blackwoods hosted a gathering at their home. Not a party exactly. More like a networking affair. Businessmen from neighboring towns had been invited, investors, landowners, a few notable judges from Lexington. The estate was freshly polished. Lanterns lined the driveway. Wine was served, and soft fiddle music drifted through the hall. Sheriff Tiller was invited, of course. And he went not to drink or dance, but to observe. He watched each brother work. The room. Elias charmed a banker near the fireplace. Emory discussed livestock valuations in the garden. Ezra hovered around the stairwell with a pair of school trustees. Elijah, ever the quiet one, drifted between groups, absorbing everything like a shadow with ears. What Tiller noticed, more than anything, was how each man answered questions. With confidence, with authority, about things they shouldn't have. Known especially if they weren't the one who'd been at the meeting, the one who'd shaken hands or signed the forms. It was as though each of them held a copy of every conversation the others had at one point. Tiller approached Elijah directly. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," he said. "Or is it Ezra?" Elijah smiled faintly, a glass of wine in hand. "Whichever you prefer, Sheriff. You're not making it easy for folks. Our intent isn't to confuse. We simply share responsibilities. There's so much to do, so many people to meet." Tiller leaned closer. "And how do you all manage to keep every detail straight? Deals, names, conversations, it's uncanny." There was the briefest pause, a flicker of something unreadable behind Elijah's eyes. "Discipline," he answered, "and communication. We share everything." That night, the sheriff couldn't sleep. His dreams were filled with shifting faces, 4 men in a mirror, speaking with one voice. One waking nightmare stuck with him. He stood at the center of town, surrounded by Blackwoods. They all wore the same suit, each stepping forward in turn to whisper a truth he already knew but couldn't accept. By the time he woke, he wasn't sure if it had been a dream at all. The next morning, he rode out to the Kincaid estate alone, early enough that the dew still clung to his boots. He didn't knock this time. He simply waited at the gate and watched. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Elias left through the side entrance. At the same time, Elijah appeared at the stables, brushing on a horse. A few moments later, Emory stepped out onto the balcony, adjusting his cuffs. And just as the sun crested over the trees, Ezra walked down the front steps, papers in hand, humming a hymn Tiller remembered hearing at Sunday service. 4 men. One face, one family, one mystery that no amount of logic could untangle. And as the sheriff stood there, silent as a stone, he realized something that sent a chill through his bones. The town wasn't watching the Blackwoods anymore. They were watching the town. By mid-October, Elkhorn Lick had become a different place. The harvest was in. The leaves were fire-colored and brittle beneath boot heels. And yet there was a heaviness that settled over the town like a storm cloud refusing to break. People didn't say it out loud, not in the stores, not at the feed mill, and certainly not at the church, but they had begun to change how they moved through their days. Doors were locked earlier. Curtains stayed drawn, even in broad daylight. Children were told not to linger near the Blackwood estate. And as for the 4 brothers, no one dared confront them anymore. What would be the point? For every strange encounter someone shared, there was always another person willing to say, "No, that wasn't them. I saw him somewhere else at the same time." The trouble was no longer what the Blackwoods were doing. It was how many people they had already done it to. Take Martha Ellison, for example. She was a seamstress who had taken measurements for what she believed were 3 separate men in the same week. One on Monday, one on Wednesday, and one again on Saturday morning. Each had introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood, and each had asked for nearly identical suits with subtle differences in stitching and buttonwork. Same voice, same smile, same left-handedness. Martha told the sheriff, wringing her hands in her lap. But they each insisted I hadn't worked with them before, and I believed them until I looked at my order book. She had noted the exact same shoe size, the same shoulder width, the same birthmark just behind the left ear. "They're not 4 men," she whispered. "They're 1 man wearing 4 skins." Sheriff Tiller didn't sleep much after that. He had tried to remain objective, to keep his badge clean of superstition. But now, even his most rational thoughts seemed to dissolve under the mounting weight of the facts. It was no longer about catching them in a lie. It was about figuring out what kind of truth they were hiding. He dug deeper with the help of his deputy and a quiet young clerk from the courthouse. He began requesting records, land, deeds, shipping manifests, tax ledgers, anything tied to the name Blackwood. What they uncovered made the sheriff's blood run cold. Each brother appeared on different legal documents filed within the same month, sometimes on the same day. Yet their handwriting was identical, their signatures completely indistinguishable. Their business dealings touched every corner of the county. Investments in land, tobacco, river freight, banking, even the new rail line creeping its way in from Louisville. But the strangest document of all was one that had never officially been filed. It arrived by post, folded between property invoices, from a courier out of Lexington. Inside was a single-page letter, unsigned and unsealed, typed in a neat serif font that few locals would have recognized. It read, "They are not what they seem. They learn faster than they should. Speak as one. Move as many. Stop asking who they are. Start asking what they're becoming." There was no return address, no postmark, no evidence of who had sent it. Sheriff Tiller stared at the paper for a long time, his knuckles white around the edges. Then he folded it, tucked it inside the lining of his coat, and said nothing to anyone. That night, he rode out to the Kincaid estate under a crescent moon, guided by instinct more than logic. He didn't knock this time. He stayed hidden in the orchard across the field, crouched behind the tangled limbs of an old crabapple tree, and watched. Just after midnight, a faint flicker of light came from the study window. One of the brothers, Elijah, perhaps, was seated at a desk, scribbling something furiously into a ledger. 2 others stood behind him, pointing to what looked like maps and diagrams. The 4th paced in tight circles, murmuring aloud, reciting numbers and names like a sermon. And then, without any visible signal, all 4 stopped moving at once. Like a gear shifting. The seated brother closed the book. The pacing one halted mid-step. The other 2 turned in perfect unison toward the window. Tiller didn't breathe. He was far enough away that he shouldn't have been visible, hidden in shadows. But all 4 men stared toward the orchard as if they knew, not just that someone was there, that it was him. He didn't run, didn't move, just sat there until the light went out. The next morning, he found a letter on his porch. No envelope, no stamp, just his name written in elegant script across the top. "There is no need for hiding. We would welcome your questions any time." That was when Sheriff Tiller knew he was no longer investigating them. They were studying him. Meanwhile, more townsfolk were reporting peculiar interactions, conversations that felt oddly rehearsed. Business meetings where the Blackwood brothers seemed to know too much about people's deaths, about their family illnesses, about things said behind closed doors. The dry goods store, old Mr. Dallin, dropped a glass jar of penny candy after realizing that the Blackwood standing before him had just referenced a conversation he'd only had with his wife the previous night. How ... How did you know that? Dallin had asked, his voice shaking. The brother Emory, maybe, just smiled. We pay attention, Mr. Dallin. That's all. Attention is the beginning of understanding. In a quiet town like Elkhorn Lick, where gossip moved faster than the river current, news of such events spread like smoke. But instead of outrage, most people began responding with something stranger, resignation. They didn't want to believe it, but they did. They didn't understand it, but they feared it. And once fear took hold, silence wasn't far behind by month's end. Few people even mentioned the Blackwoods aloud. When they passed on the street, people smiled and nodded politely, the way you might greet a preacher or a man who might know too much. They were everywhere at every civic meeting, at every financial transaction, at every dinner where strategy or politics was discussed. They weren't intruding. They were already expected. That was the trick, wasn't it? Convince a town you belong so thoroughly that your presence no longer feels strange. Convince them you're necessary. Convince them you're inevitable. The first time Sheriff Amos Tiller considered that something criminal might actually be unfolding behind the polished veneer of the Blackwood name, it wasn't because of a theft, a murder, or a fire. It was because of a meeting that, according to everyone involved, had occurred without anyone ever organizing it. It happened on November 3rd, during a private gathering at the County Mercantile Association. The meeting was intended to be small, just 6 people, landowners, bankers, and 2 shipping agents who had traveled in from Cynthiana. They were discussing railway expansion, particularly how a proposed depot near the Licking River might boost trade. No Blackwoods had been invited, and yet Emory, or perhaps it was Ezra, was seen seated quietly near the back of the meeting room, nodding along, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. What made the event truly unsettling wasn't just his unexpected presence. It was that 3 separate attendees swore they had personally invited him. But when they compared stories, they realized those invitations had been extended at the same time in different parts of town, each man claiming he'd spoken to Mr. Blackwood that morning. The contradiction unraveled quickly. One had met him at the courthouse steps. Another claimed they spoke just outside the church. The third said he bumped into him outside the blacksmith's shop near Oak Street. All within a 15-minute window, and all of them described the same detail. The exact gray wool coat, the same silver-tipped cane, and the same remark about precision being the soul of commerce. Sheriff Tiller was brought in the next day when the association's chairman, Luther Howell, voiced his concern, not that anything had been stolen, but that something about the Blackwood brothers was beginning to unsettle business leaders across the region. I don't care about their manners or their money, Hawley said, sweat darkening the brim of his hat. But when I realize I can't tell if I've met with 1 man or 4, I start wondering if I'm being manipulated, or worse, studied. Tiller took the comment seriously. He returned to his map, now cluttered with pins and notations, and began cross-referencing Blackwood sightings. What emerged was more than coincidence. It was choreography. Each brother appeared to specialize in something. Emory in trade, Elijah in public records, Ezra in diplomacy, and Elias in finance. But their movements weren't separate. They were interwoven. A note left by Elias with the town registrar at noon would be referenced word for word by Ezra during a merchant negotiation at 2. A compliment whispered to a banker's wife during a morning stroll would be mirrored almost identically by Elijah that evening at a social. The most alarming realization came when Tiller revisited earlier testimonies. Many residents swore the brothers didn't just seem to know things, they anticipated them. They were, it seemed, always one conversation ahead. He needed proof. Something undeniable. Something beyond the whispers and the stories. So he set a trap. He met with Reverend Grant and a town magistrate, Samuel Byers, both men with unimpeachable reputations. Together, they concocted a fabricated announcement. A private inheritance case to be discussed discreetly at the registrar's office. They planted the rumor gently, mentioning it only once, in a low voice near the bakery, knowing the Blackwoods often wandered nearby under the guise of pleasantries. 2 days later, before any official steps had been taken, Emory Blackwood visited. Magistrate Byers at his home with a sealed envelope. "I thought you might need this," he said with a smile. "Some legal language your clerk may not have had time to gather." Inside was a typed document, formatted as if drafted by the magistrates. Office containing exact details of the fictitious inheritance. The names. The sum. Even the property coordinates. When asked how he'd heard of the case, Emory simply tilted his head. In small towns, word travels fast. And then he was gone. That night, Tiller scribbled a single line in his leather-bound field journal. They do not eavesdrop. They observe systematically. The sheriff and his deputy doubled their efforts. They began conducting informal interviews with townsfolk. They trusted people too stubborn or too old to be easily influenced. One by one, the stories came out. Dockhands who were paid extra coin to report cargo schedules. Stable boys given sweets in exchange for names and routes of wealthy landowners. Maids and messengers who didn't realize their gossip was being used. To map the pulse of Elkhorn Lick's economy, none of these actions in isolation were illegal, but together, they revealed something far more chilling. The Blackwoods weren't just collecting information. They were mapping power. Quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. And they weren't alone. Several townsfolk began mentioning a man no one could identify. A courier, slight in build, always carrying a red ledger. He was seen slipping in and out of alleyways, dropping notes into lampposts, collecting letters from fence posts. He never spoke, never acknowledged anyone, but every time he appeared, a Blackwood brother was spotted shortly after, asking the kind of question that shouldn't be asked aloud. The courier had no name, but someone eventually called him the Runner. And, once named, he disappeared. Not a single soul saw him again, but his work? That continued. The Blackwoods now knew things they couldn't possibly know, like which families had begun keeping pistols near their front doors. Like which bank vaults were being reinforced with thicker iron, like which townsfolk were beginning to whisper about leaving Elkhorn Lick altogether. The sheriff watched as the town began its quiet retreat. Smiles became thin. Doors were knocked on less. Invitations dried up. And yet the Blackwoods remained ever-present, never unwelcome, never denied. They had found a way to make fear palatable. To dress it in courtesy, manners, and just enough plausible deniability to keep the whole charade intact. And Sheriff Amos Tiller, now certain that the town had been overtaken not by guns or force, but by intelligence, by presence, by impossibility, found himself preparing for something he couldn't name. He couldn't arrest them. He couldn't accuse them. He couldn't prove they were breaking the law. But he knew. And worse, they knew that he knew. The first robbery didn't feel like a robbery at all. No shattered window. No broken door. No muddy boot prints leading into the parlor. Just a missing box of bonds, a heavy silver brooch, and 3 handwritten letters that had been tucked away. Inside a false drawer, beneath the stairwell. The home belonged to Colonel Bernard Fletcher, a retired Union officer known for being meticulous, if not obsessive, about his personal effects. He discovered the loss on a rainy morning in mid-November. "There's no sign of forced entry," he told Sheriff Tiller, gripping his cane hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "No damage, no mess. It's as if the thief had a key and knew exactly what to take." The sheriff examined the scene himself. The lock was untouched. The housekeeper had heard nothing. And yet the drawer's secret compartment crafted, so cleverly into the wood that Fletcher hadn't even told his children about it, was empty, and worse than the missing valuables was what had been taken with them. Secrets. The kind of secrets that, if read by the wrong eyes, could ruin a man's reputation, his land holdings, even his family name. The colonel was more furious than afraid, but Tiller was afraid, especially when he heard the next day that one of the Blackwood brothers, Emory, perhaps had been seen speaking with the colonel at the tobacco exchange just the week before, smiling and complimenting the man's late wife's embroidery work. The brooch had belonged to her that same day. Tiller received a second report, this time from Matilda Carver, a widow who ran a modest boarding house on the west edge of town. She'd discovered her safe tampered with. Nothing stolen, not exactly, but the combination had been reset, the hinges cleaned, as if someone had opened it ... and then tried to make it look untouched. "I know what I'm seeing, Sheriff," she insisted, voice trembling. "I may not have a fancy education, but I've had that safe for 12 years. Someone's been inside it. Someone who wanted to know what was there, and left without disturbing a single thing except my trust." When the sheriff asked if she'd noticed anything odd that week, she paused. "Well," she said slowly, "Mr. Elijah Blackwood did stop by to ask about leasing the guest room upstairs. Polite as ever. Said he had a cousin coming in from Lexington and needed temporary lodging." "And did he rent the room?" "No. Said he'd changed his mind. Only stayed long enough to ask questions and admire the woodwork on the stair rail." That same stair rail, Tiller noted later, hid the ventilation duct connected to the safe room. The pattern was becoming clearer. These weren't petty crimes. They were rehearsals. The Blackwoods weren't stealing things, they were testing access, learning patterns, practicing the rhythm of intrusion. And more importantly, they were choosing what not to take, leaving items behind, taking only what mattered. Information. That same week, Reverend Grant found a page missing from his sermon journal. The town's undertaker noticed his ledger had been reorganized. Nothing missing, but every entry now alphabetized and dated, something he hadn't done himself. The miller, Josiah Lang, discovered his barn's ledger was gone, replaced with a freshly written copy, this one corrected for every spelling mistake and missing some. The town was being cataloged, refiled, rewritten. By whom? Everyone already knew the answer. They just weren't ready to say it out loud. Meanwhile, the Blackwoods moved through the streets like nothing had changed. Alicia escorted old Mrs. Hollis across the square. Ezra handed out apples to school children. Emory attended a reading circle at the town library. Elias, dressed in black with a gray scarf, offered to invest in the widow Carver's boarding house after hearing about her recent troubles. "Such a shame," he said. "We'd hate to see you lose such a beautiful property." She turned him down, firmly, but with trembling fingers. And when she locked her door that night, she double-checked every window. Sheriff Tiller, now running low on patience and options, held a private meeting with his deputy and 3 trusted townsmen. He laid out everything: maps, notes, affidavits, all carefully documented. They sat around a small table in the back room of the sheriff's office, the oil lamp sputtering in rhythm with the anxiety in the room. "They're preparing for something," Tiller said. "Something coordinated." "What exactly do you mean?" asked Jonas Bell, the grain merchant. "I mean, they know more about this town than any of us do. Who owes what? Who hides what? Where people keep their gold, their guns, their shame." No one spoke for a moment. Finally, Deputy Clay said what no one else wanted to. "They're not planning to run this town." He looked around the room. "They're planning to own it." The sheriff's next decision was bold, perhaps even reckless. He arranged for a known drifter, Mick Rowley, a man with no allegiance to anyone, to try and break into the Blackwood estate one night. Not to steal, but to see what he could find. Mick agreed for a generous fee and disappeared into the darkness, armed with nothing more than a crowbar and a set of lockpicks. He returned at dawn. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "I didn't even make it to the porch," he whispered. "They knew I was coming. I swear it." There was a lantern burning in the upstairs window. 4 shadows standing behind it. Just standing, watching me. He didn't take the money. He just left. And that was when the sheriff realized the house was alive. Not with spirits, but with something worse intention. As if every window were an eye. Every floorboard a listening ear. The estate didn't just belong to the Blackwoods. It was the Blackwoods. Or maybe part of them. An extension of something none of them could explain. By the end of the week, 2 more homes were silently breached. 2 more secrets gone. And in both cases, a Blackwood had been seen nearby in the days before. It was no longer just eerie. It was systemic. And no one could stop it. By the first snowfall in December, the town of Elkhorn Lick had grown quieter. Not in the usual winter-hushed way. This quiet was different, heavier. It felt as though everyone had started speaking in code, or had simply given up speaking altogether. People no longer lingered in the market square. No one stayed late at the tavern. And when folks passed one another on the street, they nodded quickly, eyes lowered. Even the bells of the church tower seemed reluctant to chime. Sheriff Amos Tiller noticed it most in the way people now whispered the name Blackwood, if they said it at all. And when they did, it was never with accusation, but with unease. As if the name itself could summon something watching, something already in the room. What the townspeople didn't yet know, but Tiller did, was that their every hesitation was being tracked. He'd begun discovering strange things, subtle, things tucked inside the ordinary. Grocery lists copied in unfamiliar handwriting. Ledger pages rewritten without the owner's knowledge. Receipts that seemed identical to the ones already filed away, except with minor alterations, a missing initial, an added digit, a changed date. He had reason to believe someone was reproducing. The town on paper. And then came the night of the winter market gala. It was the kind of event Elkhorn Lick usually looked forward to, a cheerful, lantern-lit gathering meant to bring warmth into the long season. The schoolhouse had been swept clean, its walls dressed with pine garlands and red ribbons. A band had come in from Georgetown, and the scent of cider filled the air. People came, yes, but not in the numbers they once had. And those who did kept their coats on. They smiled, but without meaning. Laughed, but without breath. And then the Blackwoods arrived, all 4. They entered together, dressed in matching black wool coats and ash-gray cravats, boots polished to mirrors, faces clean-shaven, and expressionless. They moved through the crowd like wind through wheat never stopping long, always appearing behind your shoulder just when you thought they'd gone. Sheriff Tiller stood near the punch table, watching. He tried to track them individually, watch where Elias went, where Elijah stepped, but it was impossible. They didn't split. They didn't linger. They flowed. It was the kind of movement you didn't notice until it was already finished. And they asked questions, polite ones, casual ones, but with layers. Is your son still planning to leave for Lexington in January? Did your cousin ever recover from her illness? Has Mr. Clemens settled that land dispute with the Ironworks Company? People answered before realizing they had, because the Blackwoods made it feel safe, like they already knew the answer, like they were simply confirming it, gently guiding the narrative. But what disturbed Tiller most was how few people asked them anything in return. No one said, "How do you know that?" No one asked, "Why do you care?" Because in their hearts, they didn't want to know the answers. The sheriff slipped out just before the music began, boots crunching fresh snow as he walked back toward his office. There, he poured himself a measure of rye and returned to his wall of notes. The map, the pins, the ledger books filled with eyewitness accounts that all somehow contradicted each other while still telling the same story. He stared at the word he'd written weeks ago, underlined and circled. They're not infiltrating. They're synchronizing. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood slowly, hand drifting near his revolver, and opened the door. It was Ezra. Alone, unsmiling. "Sheriff," he said, voice smooth as ever. "I believe it's time we had a proper conversation." Tiller stepped aside without a word and let him in. Ezra walked to the fire, removed his gloves, and stood warming his hands. "We've noticed your interest," he said plainly. Tiller didn't answer. "We don't blame you. It's natural. Curiosity is what separates men from animals." Still, Tiller said nothing. Ezra turned. "We admire you, Sheriff. You've taken your time. You've thought things through. Most would have acted rashly by now." "Don't mistake patience for comfort," Tiller finally said. Ezra smiled. Of course not." There was a long silence. The wind howled outside. A board creaked. "You want to know what we are," Ezra said. "I know what you're not," Tiller replied. Ezra nodded. "Then you're already ahead of most." He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the knob. "We'll be expanding soon," he said. "More families to meet, more towns to understand. But we'll remember Elkhorn Lick. It's been ... educational." Then he left. The door clicked shut like a vault ceiling. Tiller stood motionless for a long time. Then slowly he walked back to his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and removed a wooden box. Inside, a second revolver wrapped in oilcloth, a box of fresh cartridges, and a letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to the Pinkerton Detective Agency. He reread the first line. "There are 4 of them. They look the same, but they are not human in the way we understand the word." He sealed the envelope, inked the date, and slid it into his coat. It was time someone else started watching the watchers. On the morning of December 15th, Elkhorn Lick woke up to frost patterns clawing across every window pane like silent signatures. The river had frozen shallow near the edges, and the old cotton mill chimney stood like a black tooth against a pewter sky. But it wasn't the cold that stiffened the shoulders of the townsfolk. It was something in the air. A tension, as if everyone had started holding their breath without knowing why. Only one man in town knew what was coming. Sheriff Amos Tiller had not slept much the night before. His fire burned low and slow, and his boots remained beside the hearth, untouched. He had spent the evening drafting a plan, not one born of instinct or faith, but of calculation. He had decided to press the illusion until it cracked. The goal was simple: force all 4 Blackwood brothers into provable, simultaneous conflict. Not just sightings, not rumors, but physical, real-time contradiction. He reached out to Federal Agent Monroe Kane in Lexington, a man known for his cold efficiency and his preference for evidence over speculation. Kane had once sniffed out a ring of counterfeiters who had been fooling bank managers and judges alike, and he didn't scare easy. Tiller's message had been short: "Come quiet, come fast, and bring enough eyes to see what I can't." Kane arrived the next day. He brought 3 agents and a small army of suspicion. The plan was precise. At exactly 10 a.m., Sheriff Tiller would visit the Blackwood residence, with Kane himself and one of the agents posing as a courier from a bank in Frankfurt, demanding Elijah's signature for an urgent document. They would ensure the brothers remained at the estate for the duration of the visit. Meanwhile, Agent White was posted near the river docks, where Emory was expected to meet with a grain merchant about a late delivery. Agent Sloan was stationed inside the registrar's office, where Ezra had been scheduled to finalize a deed transfer for land near the southern ridge. And Agent Reeves waited outside the library, where Elias had been seen nearly every morning for the past 2 weeks, returning borrowed legal texts. Each location had eyes on it. Each agent carried a sketch drawn by Tiller himself, labeled not by names, but numbers, each face exactly the same dot at 10:02 a.m. All 4 agents made contact, and all 4 reported success. 4. Blackwoods. 4 locations. Simultaneously. Agent Sloan claimed that Ezra had signed a property deed with a flourish and shook hands with the clerk. Agent White described Emory discussing shipping contracts with dockhands, casually referencing a conversation from earlier that same morning. Agent Reeves watched Elias step out of the library carrying a book marked with the courthouse seal, one reserved only for attorneys. And inside the parlor of the Blackwood estate, Elijah sat across from Kane and Tiller, sipping coffee and answering every question with calm, disarming poise. Kane, though skeptical at first, began to frown. "This isn't sleight of hand," he whispered to Tiller. "This is choreography." After the agents regrouped, the town square became a flurry of urgency disguised as calm. They had seen what should not be possible. They had watched 4 identical men in 4 different places, each behaving with autonomy, but sharing one perfect pattern of knowledge. The problem, however, was this: the law didn't have language for that. How do you arrest a man for being seen too often? King muttered. But Sheriff Tiller was already ahead. He proposed a second test one with no room for performance. He asked each agent to write a private question, something no one else could know: a childhood nickname, a family grievance, a secret place, an unsent letter. Then, at 4 different times, in 4 different places, they would ask each Blackwood brother the same question. The questions were never shared among the agents. They were kept sealed until the moment was right. At 3:15 p.m., the agents moved. Sloan approached Ezra on the courthouse steps. White intercepted Emory near the livestock exchange. Reeves entered the library again, seeking Elias. And Kane, back in the parlor, turned to Elijah and asked, "What color was the lantern at your sister's funeral?" The answers came within seconds. All correct, every detail aligned, even the phrasing, even the tone. As if each Blackwood hadn't merely heard the question, but had been expecting it. That night, Sheriff Tiller stared out his office window, his breath fogging the glass. Kane stood behind him, arms folded. "They aren't just brothers," Kane said. "They single quotes extensions." "Of what?" Tiller asked. Kane didn't answer. Instead, he opened his briefcase and placed the signed deed copy on Tiller's desk. "The signature," he said, "is the same on all 4 documents. Not similar, identical, down to the pressure points. Same minor ink blot, same angle." Tiller flipped through each page. 4 copies, 4 moments, 4 hands. 1 imprint. Kane lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "They're either the most synchronized con men in American history, or something else entirely." And then came the final proof, delivered not by lawman, but by accident. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a kind-faced spinster who worked as a scribe at the town library, came rushing into the office just after midnight. She carried a borrowed library log, the pages flapping like frightened wings. "I was rechecking overdue lists," she said breathlessly, "and I noticed something strange." She showed them a page listing book loans from that week. Elias Blackwood had checked out 3 books, but the problem? He had signed for all 3 at exactly the same time, 10:41 a.m., the same moment. Agent Reeves had witnessed him walking past the window outside. He couldn't have been inside, but he was, and the ink on the paper was real. Kane stared down at the logbook for a long time, Finally, he whispered, "We're dealing with something way past forgery. This ... This is precision beyond human behavior." And Sheriff Tiller, who had spent the last 5 months trying to explain away every impossible thing, just nodded because deep down, he already knew. This wasn't about 4 brothers. This was about one thing pretending to be many. By the final week of December, the snow no longer felt like winter. It felt like a veil, a thick, cold silence that blanketed the town of Elkhorn Lick and muffled its heartbeat. Conversations became fewer. Doors barely opened. The postmaster reported that even mail had slowed, not because people weren't writing, but because fewer people were willing to touch pen to paper, afraid their words might be read before they were sent. And at the center of it all stood the Kincaid estate once, a grand but empty relic, now pulsing with quiet intelligence. Sheriff Tiller had begun to think of the house as an organism, not just a home, but an extension of the Blackwood brothers themselves. It was too orderly, too aware. He'd once read that in some parts of the world, certain tribes believed that places could remember, that buildings could absorb thought, echo movement, that when you walked through the wrong threshold, the place didn't just know you were there, recognized you. That was what it felt like walking up the gravel path to the young Blackwood estate, like being observed by the wood and stone itself. On the morning of December 22nd, Sheriff Tiller made a final decision. He would enter the house with federal permission, under the authority of Kane's temporary investigation into suspected multi-state fraud. No arrests, no confrontation, just observation and an official inventory of anything that might finally unravel the mystery. Kane, skeptical but curious, agreed. 2 deputies were assigned as escort. They arrived at noon. No snow had fallen that morning, but the clouds hung low like a ceiling pressing down on the earth. Even the birds had gone silent. The door was already open, not wide, just ajar. Just enough to suggest they'd been expected. They entered quietly. Inside, the house was immaculate. Not just clean, but organized. The parlor was filled with stacks of ledgers, letters bundled in silkstring, maps, diagrams, ink bottles arranged by shade and height. But there was no dust, no clutter, nothing out of place. Kane stepped into what appeared to be the study and froze. "Sheriff," he said, "come look at this." Tiller joined him and stared down at the wide mahogany desk. Laid out with military precision was a sprawling chart spanning the entire length of the county. But it wasn't topographical. It wasn't a map of roads or rivers or boundaries dotted. It was a map of people. Names, occupations, financial status, personal secrets, habits, routes walked at certain hours, children's illnesses, hidden debts, quarrels, allegiances. Symbols marked every person. A ledger of the town's humanity, cataloged and color-coded like specimens in a jar. And worse than that were the notes pinned beneath it, dozens of them, written in the same script Blackwood handwriting, some in German, some in English, some in a language neither man could identify. Tiller picked up one. Sarah B. fears abandonment more than theft. Likely to comply if given false promise of safety. He set it down without a word, not a read. Hawley family willing to trade silence for discretion. Monitor for weakness. And then, Sheriff Tiller high integrity. Cannot be bought. Watch closely. Tiller swallowed hard and looked up. That's when he noticed the portraits. They hung in a row along the stairway, 4 frames, all the same. Each held a sepia-toned photograph of a Blackwood brother. But something was off. They weren't photographs in the usual sense. They looked animated. Each image seemed slightly different when viewed from different angles. One moment, Elias appeared to be smiling. Turn your head, and he looked serious. The next moment, his gaze seemed to follow you down the hall. Kane stepped back. "This isn't just surveillance," he muttered. "This is behavioral engineering." They continued exploring. On the second floor, they found rooms arranged not for comfort, but for function. One contained wall-to-wall filing cabinets labeled with names from neighboring counties. Evidence. The operation extended beyond Elkhorn Lick. Another held a series of clocks, each set to slightly different times, with tiny labels beneath. Departure from post office, arrival at courthouse, noon bell from church tower, ... all cross-referenced. Another room was filled with clothing rows of identical suits, all the same cut and fabric, but labeled with times and dates. A system for creating not just uniformity, but continuity. And then they found the mirror room. It was the smallest room in the house. No windows, no furniture, just mirrors, every wall, every corner. Polished glass that reflected endlessly inward, like a tunnel into thought itself. Tiller stepped inside in the reflection. He saw Cain behind him, but not just Cain. He saw Ezra, and Elias, and Emory, but not standing in the hallway, standing in the mirror, unmoving. And then they were gone. Tiller backed out slowly, skin crawling, heart pounding in his ears. They found nothing illegal, nothing that could be written into a warrant. Just ... Everything. An entire town, turned inside out and studied like a machine with its back panel removed. At the foot of the stairs, they noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single envelope, pale cream, no address, no seal. Inside, a folded sheet. "Thank you for your visit. We hope it brought clarity. We look forward to seeing how you use it." Cain closed the envelope slowly. Tiller turned to him. "Do you still think this is fraud?" "No," Cain whispered. "This is architecture." That night, back in town, Tiller received a letter slipped under his office door. It wasn't signed, but he recognized the handwriting. "It is not your place to understand us, Sheriff. It is your place to remember us." And he would, long after they were gone, if they ever left at all. On the morning of December 29th, the Blackwoods were gone. No announcement, no packed wagons, no goodbyes. Just a quiet absence that hit the town like the final note of a funeral hymn lingering. Uncertain, echoing in the silence. Sheriff Amos Tiller was the first to notice. He rode past the Kincaid estate just after dawn, planning to deliver a follow-up letter from Agent King. But the house was different, not empty hollow, as if something had been extracted, as if the energy that had once pulsed through its walls had evaporated overnight. He knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. It swung open easily. Inside, the floors were swept. The fire had gone cold. The scent of ink and parchment that had once clung to every surface had been replaced with the faint trace of nothingness, clean, sterile, erased. The maps were gone. The charts, the clocks. The mirror room, empty. Just walls now, painted over, freshly patched. Not a single photograph remained on the stairwell. It was as though they had never existed. Except Tiller knew better. He searched the entire property, every room, every corner. The filing cabinets empty. The ledgers gone. The typewriter on the desk had been removed, its space now marked only by a square of dustless wood. What remained, however, was a single sheet of paper on the parlor table. No greeting. No farewell. Just one line. "You looked for truth, Sheriff. You found rhythm." That same day, Agent Kane wired the Pinkerton office from the town's telegraph station. His message was brief and cryptic. Subjects have left. Operation concluded. No arrests. No evidence. Recommendation: observe nearby towns for emerging patterns. He left Elkhorn Lick that evening without fanfare, and Sheriff Tiller, for the first time in his life, wasn't sure whether he'd failed or narrowly survived something too large to comprehend. The town, meanwhile, did what towns always do. It filled the silence with stories. Some said the brothers were spies, government, agents from a foreign power. Others believed they were part of a secret order, sent to test whether a community could be controlled without weapons, only with knowledge. More imaginative voices whispered of time loops and mirror worlds, of machines wearing skin, of a single being fractured across 4 bodies, of a living mind using the Blackwoods as vessels, eyes, and hands for something that could think in ways no man ever could. But the truth? The truth was quieter than any of those tales, and far more dangerous, because the truth was this: they had made themselves indispensable, and then they vanished, just before their usefulness reached its peak, leaving behind a town so altered by their presence that normalcy no longer seemed real. Mrs. Hollis, who had once called Emory Blackwood a perfect gentleman, began locking her doors at midday. Reverend Grant shortened his sermons and spent more time in the graveyard, muttering prayers for the living. The bank manager burned every ledger that listed the Blackwoods' accounts, terrified to discover how much of the town's money had passed through hands that no longer existed. And as for the children, they didn't speak of the Blackwoods at all. Because children know when something isn't gone. They feel it. 3 weeks after the disappearance, Matilda Carver woke in the middle of the night and found a single coin resting on her windowsill. A foreign mark, gold-edged, engraved with a symbol she couldn't place. She buried it beneath her garden. 2 months later, the school teacher Clara Devonshire found a handwritten note inside one of her lesson books. It wasn't hers. It simply said, "What did you learn from us?" She burned the book. And yet, the strangest account came from old Silas Gentry, the mule driver. He claimed to have seen them again, all 4 standing at the edge of the woods near Bell Hollow Road, watching the town from a distance, just before the snow melted for good. They weren't threatening, he told Sheriff Tiller. They looked satisfied. The sheriff didn't write a report. He just nodded because in some dark part of him, the part untouched by rules or duty or sense, he believed it too. He had seen the house. He had read the files. He had walked into the presence of something so coordinated, so perfectly designed, that it no longer needed to prove anything, and it no longer needed to stay. But the strangest consequence of all the part no one really spoke about was what began to happen to the people of Elkhorn Lick. They started mimicking the brothers, not directly, not consciously, but over time, people grew quieter, more efficient, less prone to error. Children learned faster. Business owners grew more calculating. The town clerk reorganized the records office without being asked. Reverend Grant rewrote the parish schedule in perfect columns. It was like the rhythm they'd brought with them had stuck, like some part of their pattern had embedded itself into the soil. And though the men were gone, their symmetry remained. One night, 6 months after the Blackwoods vanished, Sheriff Tiller visited the old estate again. Weeds had begun to take root along the porch. The shutters flapped loose in the wind. He stepped inside and stood in the center of the parlor where the long table had once stood, and he whispered to the empty air, "If you're still listening, we haven't forgotten." He waited. Nothing happened, but when he turned to leave, he noticed something. On the wall near the fireplace, something faint, something you'd miss unless you knew where to look. 4 handprints, perfect, clean, unsmudged. As if pressed there, not by paint or dirt. But memory. By the spring of 1871, Elkhorn Lick had returned to its routines, or so it seemed. The river thawed. The fields were tilled. The old cotton mill resumed operations with a new foreman and fresh labor. But behind every movement, behind every church, bell and market call, there was a lingering undercurrent, like a hum beneath a hymn. The kind of rhythm you don't notice until someone breaks it, and no one in Elkhorn Lick had dared break it since the Blackwoods disappeared. Sheriff Amos Tiller no longer patrolled with the same urgency. His revolver stayed in its holster, but he walked differently now, more carefully, like someone always listening for something that couldn't be heard. People noticed, but no one spoke of it. Until the letter arrived. It was postmarked from Missouri, though the writing had no trace of the Midwest in it. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, the handwriting formal, measured, calculated. Inside, a single page. A new town, a new rhythm. We thank you for your contribution. There was no signature, no name, but Tiller recognized the ink. He stared at the letter for hours, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did, perfectly. They had moved on. And they had taken what they'd needed. But what exactly had they taken? Not money, not land, not power in the traditional sense. What they had harvested was harder to define. Behavior, routine, a community's inner structure. The invisible latticework of trust and timing and memory. They hadn't come to conquer Elkhorn Lick. They had come to measure it and replicate it elsewhere. The sheriff began reaching out quietly to contacts in other towns. A telegraph clerk in Prestonsburg mentioned a group of 4 brothers arriving in February, renting a house at the edge of town. In Paris, Kentucky, a local librarian swore she had seen men who moved in echoes, finishing each other's sentences, without breaking stride. In Harrodsburg, a banker reported strange behavior in account ledgers, multiple entries signed by identical hands, but processed hours apart. The pattern was clear. They were expanding, not as a family, but as a structure. A design. By summer, Tiller had compiled a personal journal, dozens of pages thick, documenting sightings, timelines, and subtle behavioral shifts in the regions where brothers were seen. He didn't share it with Kane. He didn't report it to the state marshal. He just watched, because he'd learned by now, the moment you tried to contain the Blackwoods, you lost track of them. The moment you pointed a finger, your other hand went numb. That was the price of naming a thing too large for names. And so, he observed, he kept the lights low in his office. He left the windows cracked, even in the rain. He waited for signs, not dramatic ones, but precise ones. A name spelled differently in the town registry. Fire alarm that went off 5 seconds too late. 2 women showing up to church, wearing the same coat stitched by the same tailor, in the same week, with no knowledge of each other's order. These weren't coincidences. They were tests. Every now and then, someone new would arrive in town, a man with 2 familiar cheekbones, or a stranger who knew a little too much about the flood of '68. And when Sheriff Tiller tried to question them, they were gone before the next morning. No record, no wagon tracks. Just air. One night, 6 months after the last letter, he walked past the old Kincaid estate again. The house still stood empty, weather-beaten now, weeds up to the windows. But as he passed, he thought he saw something just, for a moment, a flicker, a shape in the second-story window, not a face. Not exactly, but a reflection of one. He stood there for a long time, boots frozen to the ground, waiting for it to move again. It didn't. But the next day, he returned. And this time, he brought chalk. He stepped into the parlor and drew a small symbol on the wall. A mark, nothing threatening, just a signature of presence. I'm still here. And 3 days later, when he came back to check, someone had answered. Not in chalk, but in charcoal. A perfect circle, drawn just beside his mark. Simple, intentional, unmistakable. They were still watching, and they wanted him to know. Sheriff Tiller didn't tell anyone. Not his deputies, not the preacher, not even the town doctor, who had once begged him to explain what had happened that winter, because the truth wasn't meant for everyone. The truth wasn't that there were 4 brothers. The truth was that there was only ever one. Or perhaps not even one. Something else. Something that could multiply thought, divide presence, replicate memory across bodies and borders. Something that didn't walk like a man, but wore a man's face. And in 1870, it chose Kentucky as its testing ground. It measured Elkhorn Lick. It calibrated its humanity. And now it was moving on. Some nights, when the wind carried the scent of burned wood and river moss, Sheriff Tiller would sit outside his office and tap his boot in time with the creaking of the porch. 1-2-3-4. He single quotes D, say nothing. Just listen, waiting for a rhythm that no longer belonged to this town, but that had at least once made it dance.